Welcome to ReImagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. We sometimes talk about technology on ReImagining Liberty in the context of how it interacts with a liberal society or how technology can help us defend and advance liberalism. The big technology everyone's talking about right now is, of course, artificial intelligence. It's a topic I've written about. Head to aaronrosspowell.com to find all of that, but not one I'd yet done an episode about specifically regarding what it means for liberalism. Then I read an essay by Ted Underwood, a professor in the School of Information Sciences and in the English department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. It's titled A More Interesting Upside of AI, and you can find a link to it in the show notes. He argues that the framing of AI technology as aiming at superintelligence is misguided, both undesirable and misunderstanding important aspects of society and culture. Instead, he's an advocate of viewing AI as a cultural technology. What grabbed my attention was his further claim that, as a cultural technology, it can help us map and appreciate cultural differences and cultural similarities in ways that line up with and support liberal principles like pluralism, tolerance, and understanding. It's a big claim, and a fascinating one, and it led to a really fun and illuminating discussion. ReImagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. Members can get episodes both ad-free and a week early. If you'd like to support ReImagining Liberty with early access and uninterrupted by ads, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Aaron Ross Powell, or look for the link in the show notes. And if you head over there and click Join for free, you'll get my every week or so email roundup of what I've written, what I'm reading, and a sneak peek at upcoming ReImagining Liberty episodes. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Ted. Maybe we start with the idea of AI as superintelligence. This is a big part of the narratives about it. It certainly is central to the marketing material of the various LLM bots that we all play with. And there's an angle to it that's really interesting. That is, if we can just create an intelligence that is like the apotheosis of smartness, that is the smartest thing possible, there won't be any conflict because it will just be right about everything, and we just listen to it and do what it says, and we don't have to disagree anymore. On its face, that sounds kind of plausible.
Yeah.
But what's wrong with that?
Yeah, I think that is sort of the utopian vision that some tech CEOs are offering to consumers right now. I think, I mean, I don't think it's to me personally, it's not an appealing vision of the future. Maybe just because I was raised in a world that sort of took for granted that contending interests were part of human welfare, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. So it doesn't seem appealing to me, but I also think it's not very probable, actually, or at least not a probable medium-term outcome of AI. And I think it came to seem inevitable that sort of the push of AI would be toward a superintelligence that would solve problems through a kind of mixture of the history of science fiction and the history of research on intelligence. They both played a role in that. And I'm not sure which was more important, but they both had the effect of nudging our understanding of artificial intelligence, of sort of machine minds more generally, because artificial intelligence is just sort of one way of thinking about this, toward a version of the technology that was identified with agency and with a very abstract and generalized concept of intelligence. So that it seemed, if you take that approach to it, it seems inevitable that the direction of change will be toward a system that has more and more control over things, more and more agency, and over a wider and wider range of things because it's more and more general. It can be persuasive. It can anticipate your counter arguments. It already has the answers. Um, I mean, we could talk more. It depends on where you want to take it. But I think there are reasons why we ended up with that vision of AI, but I don't
Yeah,
think
it seems
actually is a very plausible
to some
one.
extent to lose track of values. So as a source of disagreement. So I worked for a dozen years in a think tank in Washington, D.C. with a whole bunch of policy analysts. And these were all very, very smart people. And DC is full of very, very smart people who know an extraordinary amount about their policy areas. And they disagree with each other deeply. And sometimes that was, we don't quite have enough data to clarify which one of us is right. But often it is like, well, no, I value this thing more than that thing, so I'm willing to trade them off in this direction. And I value that other thing more than this other thing, and so I won't trade them off in that direction. But it does seem like Silicon Valley, kind of the tech sector, has this, maybe it's adjacent to like the rationalist community, but this sense that kind of thinking, that values, that emotional attachment to things, that aesthetics, that all the weird stuff that's in the humanities is somehow like a distraction from just, if you apply enough logic and reason, you get the right answer. And so the way you get smarter or better able to triangulate on the right answer is to just make yourself more reasonable and logical. And these things are the ultimate achievement of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It's not just Silicon Valley. It probably goes back to the research community that founded the field of AI, but they were all people who were coming from intellectual backgrounds where there very often was a right answer. So it seems plausible that if you're smart enough, you get to the right answer, and there you go. Yeah, I think that's part of why there is that vision. A vision of intelligence as subsuming a lot of other human activities, disagreement, expression, so on. There's other things too. I think science fiction played a role in it because, frankly, science fiction just sort of needs AI to be a character. It needs to be something that's like a person to play a role in a story. And so we're very accustomed to that metaphor, and we're not really accustomed to what we're beginning to see with language models, which is this weird gray zone where they can be very articulate. They sound sort of like a person on paper, but they also really don't have desires or goals at all, and barely have long-term memory. So there's this ability to sort of instrumentalize language, which we've always treated as sort of this coextensive with personhood and intention and so on. That's very unfamiliar, and understandably, it's difficult to sort of think through like what are these things if they're not people. But we need to be thinking it through.
Well, then let's talk about what they are if they're not people and they're not super intelligences. You talk about them as cultural technologies instead. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the term really comes from Alison Gopnik, and when she coined it, I think it was partly a dismissive term. She was wanting to say, I work with children. I know what child intelligence is like, and these systems, impressive as they are not doing the kind of exploratory things that I see children doing. They're just, for her, transmitting patterns of behavior, like the other examples of cultural technology she gave were things like printing press, writing, libraries. They don't originate ideas, but they're very important at transmitting them. Now, for her, that was because she's a psychologist who works on children and intelligence. That was they're just cultural technologies. For my background is in cultural history, and writing and the printing press, from my perspective, there's no mirror about that. It's true that the printing press doesn't go out and independently invent things, but the printing press plays an enormous role in making it possible for human beings to coordinate. across space and time and do impressive, science. It would be very difficult. Certainly without writing, science would be super difficult. We could talk it all out, but comparing the different versions of an argument, different aspects of a data set would be really, really hard. So cultural technologies can be enormous. They make it possible to do completely new things, even if they are not themselves innovating persons. And I think it's fair to say that AI, certainly the version of AI that we're looking at right now with language models, text-to-image models, is another cultural technology. It's trained on examples of human thought or examples of images and videos, and it's replicating those patterns, not those exact examples, but it's learned templates, patterns that it can transmit, but also, hybridize and combine. Ideas from different fields can combine in the language model in a way that might actually be productive of innovation. A lot of innovation is combinatorial, is ideas from different places coming together. So I think that's, we should think of AI not as like a person or a super intelligence, but as a form of culture and a form of transmission, and also kind of cultural forms are where we work things through, right? Like the novel, it doesn't just transmit ideas. You can think out, like, what would someone like Don Quixote be like, and you get a different insight into the ideas that drive him when you work that out in a story. Similarly, I think AI is going to be a cultural form that allows us to work through the consequences of, beliefs, rhetorical patterns, all of that.
I want to dig more into all of that because I think it's absolutely fascinating, and you draw some really interesting conclusions from that perspective on it. But I'm curious to what extent the recognition of, maybe only a subconscious recognition of AI as a cultural tool versus the way that we think about other technological tools. Like we're talking over Riverside.fm and using these cool microphones, and we're half a country apart geographically, and that's all awesome, but it's not really, and we're producing, this is used to advance culture. Like people will listen to this conversation and it will spark ideas and so on.
Yeah.
But we don't think of the technologies that we're using as specifically like engaging with the culture, instead of being just like a medium for exchanging it. But the AI, like I'm wondering if part of the real visceral dislike of this tech, because there are people who hate this stuff. There are people who love it, but there are people who hate this stuff.
Yeah,
and
they do.
And a lot of that hate, some of it is, there's like IP arguments that I think in a lot of cases don't really stand up to scrutiny. There's clearly like just economic, this will eviscerate the market for the stuff that I am skilled at, which is a perfectly understandable response to have to the technology. But there's also just this like, there's something profoundly off-putting about what this does.
Yeah.
And that it feels like it's latched onto that notion of it as engaging in culture or cultural artifacts or cultural outputs.
Yes.
In a way that the software you and I are using right now and the microphones we're using don't.
Right. People, people have mixed feelings about cell phones. There's a moral argument or a cultural argument about cell phones, but it's of a different kind, because cell phones are actually sort of in a gray zone between like just a transmission medium and something that is a form that has its own sort of expressive potential. But AI evokes stronger feelings, and I totally agree with you. It's not just self-interested economic response. There's something that's more visceral than that. And it's partly the sort of traditional uncanny valley thing people have about, this sort of gray area of personhood that makes us uncomfortable with dolls, and even more so when it's as eloquent as some of these programs. But it goes beyond that. And I think what you're gesturing to, the the word that maybe we could seize on as sort of embodying the unease people have with AI as culture is the word slop. I think it conveys a lot of um, the feelings people are groping to express here. It's kind of it's of course the word is meant to suggest that there's something banal, homogenized, boring, kind of official about a lot of AI expression, be it images or text, which is somewhat true for a variety of reasons. These models might inherently sort of tend toward a common denominator, and certainly after they're tuned by a corporation's sort of PR department, they tend toward being bland. But it goes beyond blandness. The idea of slop is that it sort of spills out. It's uncomfortably liquid. And a lot of the fears that people have about AI slop is that it will sort of infect culture. It will expands out of control. It just multiplies automatically. And yeah, I think that it's not, it's not all of these fears probably will come to pass, but that metaphor is genuinely grappling with what's new and uncanny about a technology that is also itself culture, itself a mode of behavior. Yeah, and that can replicate and imitate modes of behavior.
Is that visceral reaction to it made stronger by the fact that it's specifically about language? People get upset about like Midjourney making images, but a lot of the really like existential kind of angst about this, or it's going to like destroy the world, is on the text side of it. And I wonder, first, like, it seems like we're used to, you look at like a electrical outlet and see a face, and we kind of recognize like that wasn't built as, or you see like I was reading a book recently that had a picture of that face on Mars from back in the 90s, I think, that, and people kind of recognize like, oh, well, it wasn't really created, but it just, our brains tricked us into. We're used to that. We're not used to something that tricks us into thinking it has linguistic meaning, really. And that is linguistic meaning. Right. And you mentioned this in your article, is really, you have a line I very much like about how we're really, when it comes to just like raw intelligence, we're not all that greater than the great apes. But what sets us apart and has enabled us to do all of the things that we have done is language. And this stuff is like latching onto that in a way that technology never has before.
Yes, that's, I'm echoing Christopher Manning's article there on natural language, and it's in Daedalus. And it's the first paragraph of that is something I quote often because he does point out it's really language and social coordination that makes human beings different from other primates. It's, whether we're smarter than bonobos is a little bit debatable. Depends on what if we're reasoning about how to get to fruit, we might not outclass bonobos. But language is just totally different. We can coordinate in ways they definitely cannot. And what I would say about this, actually, I think the importance of language does make people uneasy about the sort of slop character of generative AI in a different way than with images, although there's certainly unease about images too. But the thing about language is actually that particular sort of concern is not actually that new. People get angry when you talk about this, but there was actually an argument about writing and some unease about writing for some of the same reasons, which is that, if you go back to Plato's Phaedrus, it kind of looks like a person. It's pretending to be a person in Plato's dialogues. Like, it literally is like they're representations of personalities interacting, but they're not people. There's already a bit of that uncanny valley feeling about separating language from the living person in responses to writing. And I don't think Plato was the only one. Like that unease, if you read the Derrida, you'll discover that unease sort of never goes away. So I do think there's something distinctive about the way language, the sort of separation or alienation of language from the person that makes people more uneasy than image models, but it's not a new thing, not totally new.
Does this mean that to understand this tech, we need to? You mentioned Derrida, and I recommend you can find his essay Plato's Pharmacy online
Yeah,
pretty easily, and it's a lot of fun.
yeah.
But have we kind of has technology backed us into French theory again and like linguistic theory that we all need to be reading these guys?
Yeah. I actually have an essay out there called The Empirical Triumph of Theory, where that is basically my argument. Um, uh, it's very much the case that if structuralists came, were woke up in 2025, they would say, yeah, like this is what I said. Like authors are not that important. Discourses are actually often the agency that drives things. Foucault and Barthes certainly would feel justified. And I actually think, that's sort of a neat irony, I guess. But doesn't go much further than that. But I actually think there's more substance to it than that. Actually, I do think that the recognizing that what it really makes AI powerful is that it transmits culture, and that it's what it does is going to depend very much on like what cultural presuppositions and forms it's transmitting. I think at some point, actually already it's begun to, but at some point it's really going to sink in that means that thinking about culture is now central to this economically crucial technology that is shaping the future. I'm not quite optimistic enough to think that means that, there are going to be tons more jobs for art historians. Not necessarily, right? There are many different ways of thinking about culture, and there are kinds of training you may need to do that with AI that certainly like art history departments aren't currently giving students. But this isn't sort of an either or thing. There is an interesting gray area there where we're going to have to think about what these models can do, should do, how flexible should they be, like how many different perspectives should they be, should they let users explore, and how do we push them further? Like how do we make them less boring? Those are going to be really, really fascinating questions they are the kinds of questions the humanities have typically explored. I don't know whether the people who explore them in the 2040s are going to call themselves humanists, but they're cultural questions.
Can we, just to make things a bit more concrete for someone who's listening to this and saying, okay, well, what does this actually mean? What does it mean to use this thing as like a tool for studying culture,
what does that mean?
remixing culture, or understanding culture? Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that's easiest, I'll give two examples. So one I already gestured toward, which is sort of um, it's sort of already in the news. Like, what political points of view are language models allowed to assume? How much control should their owners have over their political points of view? Like Grok and Elon Musk's control over Grok is very much a hot button issue, and something that people are um, uh, feeling cynical about right now. And that's their right to. Like that, if these language models are really, if people are going to use them heavily, then it really matters like what breadth of perspectives they have. So that's something we're going to fight over. But I think we can already see that. The thing that interests me a little bit more is because my background is in cultural history before I got into AI, I'm very interested in training historical language models that represent sort of reading and writing practices as they existed in 1914 or 1925 or 1880. And what could we learn maybe about culture by, for instance, we often debate, well, we interpret that novel as being sort of ironic, but could readers at the time have seen that this character was actually a villain? Well, it's hard. You may or may not have book reviews that answer that question for you, but you can go back to a model trained on other writings of the time, and that might give you some sense of how readers in 1880 would have responded to that character. You can ask very specific questions. So it's a little bit, it's not quite like a time machine. There are limits, not everything has been preserved, but there are fun things we're going to be able to do with recreating past points of view and maybe, exploring alternate points of view.
I'm reminded of, there's that Oliver Stone film, JFK, which I watched a lot when I was a teenager. And it's his grand conspiracy about the JFK assassination. And it's completely crazy. But one of the things that he emphasized, he plays up, there's this, at the time of the shooting, there was a guy with an umbrella. And it wasn't raining in Dallas, right? And so what, that guy with the umbrella, why would you have an umbrella? Well, now conspiracy thinking. And it's example, I think, of like what you're talking about past context, because it was a reference to Neville Chamberlain being a Nazi appeaser, and it was a criticism of JFK. And like, so, but people at the time, or a lot of people at the time, would have recognized that that's what it was. But without that context, it's just a guy with an umbrella, and that's weird. And so it must have some other, we invest meaning in things, but we don't have the context for the meaning, so we invent different context. And it seems interesting that we could use AI to spot those sorts of things that like you or I as a reader with the context we have right now would miss.
Right. Or even ask maybe like which aspects of the writing of a given period made it possible to have this thought. Like I'm currently collaborating with Laura Nelson, who's interested in the history of feminism. She works at University of British Columbia. And one of the questions that interests her is sort of which feminist documents or writings made certain ideas possible. And that I think is another way we might use historical language models. But, I'm a historian, so that's what interests me. There are so many other things people can do with these. I think our imagination of what AI can do is currently very limited by the fact that it sort of came to us from a few big Silicon Valley firms. So people are still imagining it as probably something that will be controlled by a small number of corporations, and will only ever be interested in sort of the common denominator, things that can make a lot of money. But I'm not certain that will remain true. I mean, China is already giving Silicon Valley a run for its money. France, Japan want to do so too. It's not clear to me that the US or a few firms in the US are going to monopolize this. And if we get really decentralized open source AI, we're not guaranteed to, but if we do, one of the interesting effects of that could be now you've got a lot of people who don't own film studios or, TV stations who have a kind of ability to explore culture, a kind of agency over culture that we are not accustomed to. Like, they can go in and edit. They can hybridize genres. It's like fan fiction, but on a much bigger scale, because you're not just producing a single story. You're able to produce a new set of possibilities for cultural expression.
Latch on to the new set of possibilities comment for a moment. One of the many critiques of these tools is that they can't create anything new, that they can't do anything novel, because all they can do is draw on their training data, and their training data is just a system of like weights and probabilities. So they're just kind of predicting what fits best with the mass of data that they have been trained on, which is like definitionally not novel or unique. And this then turns into like the slop, that everything they produce is crap because they can't do. But I remember a YouTube series a while back called Everything is a Remix that got a lot of attention, that like, I wonder to what extent some of that is just, that's what we do. like that's what human beings do, is we remix and we pull together and we spot interesting links and so on. And this thing's doing that now too, but at a scale that is extraordinary. I mean, that's the thing, is it's like, I've read a lot of books about a lot of different topics. I can draw connections between things, but I haven't read everything that's on the internet. And all of the books that they've gotten access to legally or illegally.
Yes.
Like, it can draw on a lot more possibilities of connection than I can.
Yes. I think we are going to find out the answers to some questions that about creativity and about innovation that have preoccupied people for a long time, and that we all have opinions about, but that we really don't know the answers to. And one of them is how much of innovation is what you've just described, what people sometimes call combinatorial creativity. How much is it sort of remixing ideas from different sources? I think clearly some of it is. Maybe a whole lot of it is that just sort of genetic recombination of memes, like of genes. And anyone who's worked with these models can sense like how powerful that could be, because when you ask questions, trying to understand some problem that you're working on, I feel my own mind being expanded, because I'm not an expert on all these adjacent fields, but the model knows a lot about a lot of fields, and it can bring to bear ideas that you wouldn't have thought of. And that definitely feels liberating. There might be a limit to it, right? Like at some point, the Wright brothers have to go out there on a sandy beach in North Carolina and see what happens when you put this, bicycle engine or internal combustion engine on a frame, and no one can predict really exactly what's going to happen there. That's not just combinatorial. And there may be, in fiction or film, there may be things analogous to that, where like there is some kind of innovation that goes beyond remixing. I don't think we really know what the boundary is between those two things, but it's possible that could be one of the interesting things we discover.
How does this interact with ideologies? You mentioned earlier in the conversation, there's these fights right now about what political perspectives these bots center or even are willing to reference or acknowledge. We have, just today, I was seeing more news. We're recording this on July 23rd, of the Trump administration having new AI policies or proposals. And part of it is like, they're very concerned that like these things are biased against Trumpism.
The peril of woke AI, I think, is the term of art. Yeah.
When Grok a week or two ago had its meltdown and was calling itself Mecha Hitler and being openly Nazi, I saw a post on Blue Sky that I thought was interesting in this regard, about how what it exposed was Grok was kind of increasingly trained on Elon Musk's tweets, and they had updated its default prompt to include look up what Elon Musk has said about this. And the issue was Elon Musk says a lot of things that are what Nazis say, but he insists he's not a Nazi. And what Grok was kind of exposing about that is like, it kept saying, no, yep, I'm a Nazi. And so it was like putting the lie to his claim, because it was like, look, if you say all of this, then that's what you are, versus, it undid the plausible deniability about his own ideological worldview. But at the same time, there's this real worry that I think is legitimate, that, these models can be extremely persuasive. We see this in the stories of people just driven nuts by these things, or the way that it can just talk you into, or the studies I've seen about how good they can be at talking people out of conspiratorial beliefs, because they're like very patient in a way you or I might just grow tired of the QAnon person after a while. But does that mean that if I can use these as tools of understanding, but also if I want to convince a group of people to do really bad stuff or vote for really bad stuff, I now have like a superpower of persuasiveness. I can figure out the like invisible hooks in their cultural and belief beliefs and pull on those and do
Yes.
bad ideological things.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've really well articulated the sort of two different perspectives on this, that honestly we don't know which one is right or what the balance is between them, but they're both important perspectives. The sort of optimistic one would be, because the model because it's interactive, because you can sort of test it and probe it, it exposes the consequences of a habit of thought. So, for instance, with Elon Musk sort of flirting with Nazism, the bot reveals like things that he's trying to walk right up to the edge of, but the consistency of the system will reveal that. That's the optimistic thing, would be to say not only that sort of bad ideas will get exposed, but what people are really hoping, and this is an idealistic hope, is that there's a kind of coherence of good ideas, that like you can't come up with true ideas and push reason effectively, basically, even at the level of code, if you don't have some degree of candor and willingness to entertain contrary opinions. And like in an ideal world, people gesture at this as sort of Platonism hypothesis, because it's sort of the idea that the true and the good are related. In an ideal world, we would find out what ideas and sort of intellectual orientations are truly effective. And I don't know if that's true. Like that's the ideal. That's the really happy vision of this. But the negative possibility, you also outlined clearly, it is possible. These models are very persuasive. If it turns out to be just a question of crafting something that can be duplicitous, the models aren't really great at that yet. They're not really able to have an idea and then say something different, partly because they think out loud. But it's conceivable that they could be really used in a truly terrifying way to manipulate people. I don't think we know which way that will swing, but it's a very important question.
When we talk about this, using them to understand culture, it's a lot of this has to do with understanding both cultural differences. So I can map out the beliefs of this kind of set of cultural artifacts over here and see what's going on and how they're distinct from this set over here. So it's understanding difference, but it's also, as we've talked about, understanding connection. That what looks different might have really interesting connections that we weren't aware of, or interesting overlaps.
Yeah.
And this gives me the opportunity to bring up like the thing when I was reading your essay, where I was like, okay, I want to bring Ted on the show to talk about this, was that ability to do that analysis and to do it on, and I think like basically a playful way. Like that seems to be the main use case for a lot of people. Tons of people are spending money every month to have subscriptions to these models. And so the vast majority of people are just using this to have fun because they're fun to play with. But they have access now to this stuff. That struck me as, and you acknowledge this it's kind of liberalism in action, that liberalism is extending our, like the moral circle to people who are different from us. And it is seeing the differences and appreciating the differences, but it's also then beginning to see the connections and the similarities. This is why like the people who most oppose immigration are the ones who live in areas where there are the fewest immigrants. The people who actually live among immigrants think immigration is awesome, even though they recognize that these people are very different than them in all sorts of ways. But you start to see the similarities. That was where I was like, oh, we tell doom stories about this technology, and we have talked about some of the ways it could go very wrong in this conversation. But it also feels like this way of understanding cultural differences and connections and maps and so on has a real possibility to
Yeah.
make us more accepting of diversity, more
Yeah.
understanding, more willing to extend that like liberal sphere outward.
Yeah. I think there's a pretty strong argument for that. And this might be a sort of version of the optimistic case for AI and culture that that I'm actually willing to stand behind. I'm not certain about the Platonist sort of version where like the good and the true naturally go together, and maybe, maybe, but that feels like a risky hypothesis. I can imagine lots of ways that would not be true. But it does seem to be pretty true that these models kind of inherently involve diversity. They're large language models. They're trained on a lot of stuff. You can filter, but you're going to be excluding possibilities when you do that. And I do think that there is something in there where I wouldn't say it guarantees tolerance or openness by any means, but it seems likely to be a space where there will be inherent rewards for tolerance and openness. Now, maybe this is just because I think there are inherent rewards for tolerance and openness already, but I think the language model may make that quite palpable and sort of empirically demonstrable even. I would be willing to guess that that might be one of the good consequences. Now, that said, getting our existing language models to a space where they're even sort of capable of pluralism is still a lift, because they're not really right now. They're not not only sort of like global cultural pluralism is lacking just because they're trained on a mostly sort of English language dominated internet. But even within like the English language and even within texts that they've seen, like, like 19th century texts, given my interest in history, they're actually really bad at forgetting what they know about the present and putting themselves in another point of view, like say a Victorian point of view. If you ask them to talk like a Victorian, they will actually talk like the internet thinks a Victorian talks, like a kind of a parody of old fashioned. And that difficulty with sort of switching perspectives, it's maybe just academic if we're talking about history, but it becomes a bigger problem when we're talking about different social, political points of view. We have some work to do to create models that are really capable of that. But I people are working on it, and they're working on it because I think that there are going to be rewards, both sort of intellectual and concrete commercial rewards for getting models to work that way. So yeah, that's a kind of optimism I would be pretty confident about.
For listeners, then, I mean, maybe I have listeners who are on the like, this technology is the devil, burn it down side. But they probably haven't made it to this point in the conversation. Yeah. They like rage quit the episode. Yeah.
Those people are gone.
And I may have some listeners who are on the like extreme optimist, super intelligence, end of conflict, etc.
Yes.
But for those who are like in that middle, who kind of can see some uses of this stuff, but also can see some of the concerns, the economic impact, maybe maybe the theft of artists and writers' work concerns, maybe the kind of dehumanizing of like the weirdness of the like it's doing things that a human should do, like those kinds of things. I guess to close, like how do you have advice on like how to think about this? Because this technology isn't going anywhere. We're not going to get rid of it. It's going to continue to expand. It may not expand to the level that the extreme optimists think, because it may turn out all these things we're plugging it into, it's actually that I just saw a story today that the FDA, they've been trying to use it to like find and approve drugs and other things, and internal FDA people are like, it just is constantly like hallucinating studies and things. Like it doesn't work for this. We may find that a lot of the stuff it's being exuberantly shoved into, we pull it back out of. But like how to think about this moment where things are weird, they're probably going to get weirder, but we can't really go back.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wrote the blog post to give people a more interesting upside to think about. And, you know, that's explicitly not to make them optimistic or cheer them up exactly, because I think it's important to acknowledge we don't really know the consequences. And the consequences even of technologies that we now think of as largely positive, like the printing press. The printing press caused a lot of religious debate in Europe and probably contributed to some extremely bloody wars. So it's not like I certainly would not feel comfortable saying, the consequences of this technology are going to be net positive in the next 100 years, or even go out as far as you want. I don't know that. But I do think it's important for people to see that there are good possibilities, that there are ways that this could expand the range of things we can do, expand or even our imagination of things to do. Um, and that it's not just about being more efficient, doing your work a little faster. Certainly, I hope not about like creating either a super intelligence that will run our society, or even I don't think we're creating a bunch of artificial people that will do what people do. I don't actually think that's what we've done with this technology so far. Instead, it's something that is stranger, that is in this weird cultural zone that some people can rightly feel uncomfortable about as slop, but that also has potentially possibilities for cultural creativity and for potentially sort of giving individuals or small groups of people the ability to sort of change, edit, modify, map cultural forms in ways that we can't currently do. So it could be empowering, could open a range of possibilities. There's at least an upside to think about. Where the balance falls, I think you always have to go forward in any aspect of life, right? We don't know that things are going to get better, but you try to make them better. That's what we do. We don't go forward because we know they're going to be better. That's not something we tend to get.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of ReImagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.